webinar in our 2023 season. And I'm happy to start off with just a couple of opening announcements and then introduce our guest speaker, who we're so happy to have, Remi Ham, who will be talking about foodscaping. Then we will move on, and Matt and or be on the lookout for insect and pest diseases that'll be coming up in the next month. Caroline will share a resource spotlight. This is a new feature for this season that spotlights an extension resource that you can find helpful for your garden and that you can also use in programming for the public. So let's jump on. Just a quick announcement. Well, not a quick announcement. Just want to say a hearty thank you to everybody who is here today, and to all of our Master Gardener volunteers and our extension agents and volunteer coordinators and everybody who's part of the Extension Master Gardener program across North Carolina. Our annual report hits on just a few of the wonderful things that are happening across the state, thanks to Master Gardener volunteers. We encourage you to check that out. Of course, we've got some of our statistics here. We've got over 3,500 Master Gardener volunteers across the state, and just last year volunteered almost 100,000 hours, and that is almost back to pre-pandemic levels. So we definitely, saw a reduction in volunteer activity 2020, 2021, but last year, 2022, we saw the activity levels really coming back to what it had been. So we're so excited to see that, and just have things back in person, and hopefully everybody is able to participate and feel safe, and is really having a great time and enjoying being part of the Extension Master Gardener program. And with that, I want to introduce Remi Ham. Remi is going to be our guest speaker today. She's speaking about foodscaping, or designing with edible crops. Remi is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Horticultural Science. She has both a teaching and extension appointment, so she does both extension work and she teaches as part of the curriculum, the horticulture program curriculum. Her experiences include landscape design, city planning, and campus project management. Remi's most recent work is focused on designing edible teaching gardens and developing environmental curriculums for K through 12 schools. Within the Department of Horticultural Science, Remi teaches classes ranging from home food production to gardening with herbaceous perennials, as well as exploring principles and practices of culture. Additionally,
Charlotte, we just lost your sound, I think, so I'm just going to finish up and welcome Remi. I think the little last part of your bio that we wanted to mention was that you're working additionally with the Extension Farm to School. You work as the Extension Farm to School coordinator, and that Farm to School team works to expand statewide education and outreach, while also advancing farm to school as an educational and community food security strategy. So we welcome you, Remi, and let's see, making sure that Charlotte has stopped sharing so that you can start to share your slides. And we thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to just transition and try to share my slides here, and
perfect.
And then get kind of loaded up. I'm going to swap view. Are you seeing my slides? Okay.
We are, yes. Looks
right.
good.
Let's see. I want to make sure you're seeing the right view. It's always hard when you have to.
I know. There's all sorts of.
Yeah.
There we go. Nice and full screen.
Perfect. Okay, that's great. Well, first, it's so great to be here with you all this morning. Thank you for the wonderful welcome. And I'm excited to speak about this topic because it's something that's so dear to me, foodscaping and designing with food and ornamental landscapes together. So thanks again for the introduction. So I won't even land on there for a long time, but hello, I'm Remi Ham, everyone. And I was introduced so well. So, here's just a little bit more about myself, assistant teaching professor in horticultural science, but also have an extension role. And kind of just wanted to show you some highlights. As noted earlier in the intro, I have landscape design and landscape architecture as my background. So through the lens of all of my work, whether it's through teaching herbaceous perennials, whether it's home food production, as seen here, Plant with Students each season, or any of the classes that I'm teaching, is always kind of through the lens of function and beauty. So that's what we'll kind of go through even today, and hoping to share some ideas with you. And I also, even in the questions that you have after I wrap up, I love to even hear your experiences or things that you've done that may have worked and lessons learned. So here at Food Production, I have my students always getting their hands dirty. A lot of the students that I have never planted anything. So it's really fun to get them in the garden and get them growing, and here, in food production, of course, I have to try to introduce them to thinking beyond typical raised beds. Raised beds are great, in-ground gardening is great, but what if we really think about how we use our typical ornamental landscapes, and can we use them for function? And those are things that we explore in this class as well. So here I have students, if you can see on the left-hand side, we're planting kale. And the thing about our food crops is that they offer so much beauty. I mean, purple and green kale, an amazing combination, just thinking about how we can use the array of greens and pinks and purples that emerge from our crops that we can use in a design scape. And even for our herbaceous perennials, how can we even take advantage of our pollinator friends and our beneficial insects and strategically place them in the garden with our food crops. So just here, I have a kind of a roadmap, like I always like to have in any kind of presentation that I give, of like, all right, so how are we going to walk through this chat? And first, we'll kind of start with definitions of like, all right, how am I defining foodscaping? Because I know that this term may mean something different to others. So I'll define it as I'm speaking to it. Just highlighting the importance, how are we thinking about like, why is this even an important thing to consider or practice, to implement, design tips, which, we'll hit on that for a while. And then also look at some of my favorite annuals and perennials to incorporate in the garden. So with that, starting with our definition and how I would be defining it today. In foodscaping, I'm defining it today as a strategic integration of food producing plants in the garden. And being very strategic, thinking about our seasons. I know that I'm among gardening friends here. So we're thinking about our seasonality, we're thinking about fruiting crops, we're thinking about even height and scale and placement, so that strategy incorporates not only just the food, but the placement and thought behind it, even our soil conditions. So those are all things kind of encompassed in that strategic integration category that I have in green here. So let's talk about how we can merge beauty and function, which I love kale. I also love edible flowers that we have here, and Swiss chard I don't think gets enough love, because those purple hues or rhubarb or anything that has really beautiful color, even on the stems, are great. So all the pictures, I'm going to try to go through it, keeping it in time in mind, but then also just highlight some of my favorite things on images. But beauty and function, this picture here is, speaking of that, our typical American landscape that we often see, which is great. If this works and it's even if your home looks like that, that's awesome. You have your shrubs, we have, typical, maybe like one kind of border choice for a species. And then, but the question is, what if we started to think about our landscapes in a way, thinking of beauty and function, and it would come from this to this. This is just a different angle, same house. But what if we really thought about strategically how we can use our landscapes to be ecologically friendly, attract wonderful pests, be inhabitants for some of our creatures that we share our earth with, but also that we can harvest from it. And even in this picture alone, I'm seeing lettuces, I'm seeing some chives, I'm seeing wonderful pollinating attractant plants. And this is just inspiration, but there's just so much here. And while this is maybe on the more, I don't want to say extreme spectrum, but more mature spectrum as far as foodscaping. But this is just inspiration of what we can rethink our landscapes possibly to be. So here, those are just definitions, but highlighting importance. And even on my left here, I have an array of sages, which are really nice and beautiful, and also flower really nicely. But let's look at the importance. And I know in this group, a number of us have been to the grocery store and we've seen the prices of food. I'm not going to land on these slides too long, but the prices of food are going sky high. So how do you practically meet the needs of, supplementing our food prices, helping to, even when we speak to food insecurity, which are areas that I work in, even through extension in my work at state, how do we really think about using our landscapes to help connect or fill in the gaps for food insecurity, especially as our prices of food are raising at, rates that we have at higher rates. But then even looking at the ecological balance, and here's just another example of a food space. It's wonderful to introduce a foodscape or have a foodscape on site. And this is very diverse. I'll want to know that there's a mix of raised beds, but then also a mix of foodscaping even in ground. But understanding that a more diverse planting helps with ecological balance, even helps with maintaining nutrients in our soil, attracting beneficial insects, helping just also to supplement our food in terms of being able to harvest from the land that we are planting in. So those are just like some of the importance to think about. I really want to land mostly on the conversation of design tips and what are some things like, okay, the why, the what is, the why, and then mostly want to land on the how here. And in the how, and again, I was like, even looking at design tips of how we can use what's above and what's below, and how we can create a layering system in the designs that we are creating for our foodscapes. Always keeping in mind, of course, soil, nutrition, always keeping in mind, the light as we're growing edible crops, and also our irrigation. So those are things just as an overarching theme when we're talking about our crops, just a mutual understanding that these are things that we're keeping in mind as well. Soil, sun, and also the amount of irrigation that's needed for crops. So designing with our crops, what are some questions to ask? And I want you all to kind of really think about the different kind of species with even in crops, so you have lettuce, but there's many different lettuce cultivars that can have different textures and colors and highlights. There's a great palette that you can just have off of lettuce alone, or our kales, or there's so much, right? So questions to ask that I usually always start with and recommend people to start with are the following. Those are, what is your desired level of garden care? As we know, some crops are not fussy, like kale. I always go to that in a foodscape because kale isn't too fussy. Whereas tomatoes may be a little bit more, you got to take care of those a little bit more, or even our cucumbers, you have to take care of those more. So think about the desired level of care, whether it's a residential area or even if it's at a public space. How often do you really want to harvest? Some crops require more harvest than others, especially to keep their health going. And then also, what's the frequency of planting that's needed? For example, when I think of frequency of planting, I'm thinking of our root crops. It is recommended that even like if you want carrots to plant them in sequence, like maybe every 2 weeks, plant our carrots. So that way you can always kind of have a harvest coming on. So think about the frequency of planting that's needed as well. Or annuals versus perennials, which I love perennial plants because they come back year after year like strawberries. Strawberries are amazing and they come back year after year. So kind of think about, these are the 3 questions that I kind of start with and land on, aside from the site analysis and site planning, etc. So I'm going to just advance these as far as design. I'm always thinking about balance. And I'll go to the gray highlights: balance, color, and also arrangement. And thinking of balance, we're trying to create more of a rhythm and texture. And I'll show you what this looks like in the following slides. Color, thinking about pattern and cohesion, especially with our color and even our balance. Planting is in groups, so planting in masses, especially as you're planting an edible foodscape. Planting in masses is really nice for a more design impact, even going back to the green and purple blend that you saw in the earlier slides. Masses give you a bigger, pact, but then also thinking about the food that you actually want to produce. And then also arrangements trying to establish focal points, fillers, and also underplantings, really thinking about our borders, etc. So we'll kind of go through this and through that lens. So starting with balance. And I will tell you, I am a big fan of cool season gardening. I mean, I love warm season gardening, especially as it's coming upon us. I have my tomatoes started as well. But cool season gardening, and our cool season crops give us such a wonderful, they're not fussy, they're wonderful in terms of, being able to plant them. And some of our crops take a little bit longer to develop, like cabbage, right? So we have our cabbage and our chard and purple cabbage and green cabbage and all those things in between. So this is just kind of to show you what our cool season crops can look like, but balance, how do you kind of create a rhythm? So here we have chard. If you're kind of following my cursor here, I'm hoping that it shows up. And then also we have our cabbage and then chard again, and then introducing purple cabbage. So how do we create sequence and patterns and balance in our foodscape? Or even something more simple, something as a balance of, and thinking about height, rhythm, and texture, as I have here noted, thinking about just doing one kind of plant, introducing, one row of chard here along this shrubbery. Like, I love that it's introducing a formal scape. And then, okay, we're going to switch it up and we're going to add some cabbage to it. So those, and using purple and green cabbage there. So there's different ways to do that. And then even in a less formal setting or design, how do we integrate the balance in as creating patterns? So here we are, purple cabbage, and then green cabbage. So in balance, things to think about are, how do you establish a consistent rhythm with your plants? How do you establish a consistent height? And how do you also keep in mind texture as well? So those are things just to help think about. And I love the blend of even having our ornamental flowers integrated, which is just so great for ecological balance as well. So these are just other images of that. So just to land on I always like to kind of summarize what I just noted. Balance, thinking of groupings, I like to plant in odd numbers, so groups of 3s, groups of 5s or 7s, it helps with that balance. Try to establish a repetition, so whether it's a repetition of color, whether it's a repetition of plant type, or even repetition of that textural quality, those are things that help establish a balance. And then also think about your height distribution. So think about focal points and creating a balanced low, or even using those plants that kind of are trellis plants. Those are wonderful to kind of create some balance. And I love to plant in pots. So here I have some featured of my pots. I always have like little garden gnomes or frogs that are planted here, but I like to plant sage, and I have some sedums that are ornamental crops. So those are things that you can kind of have established there as well. Thinking of color, green, there's so much color in our edible crops, but even how to integrate them with our flowering crops or flowering plants and our ornamental plants. I like perennials because, again, they come back year after year, and maybe I'm a little biased because I teach a perennials class, but when we're thinking about our color, I'm going to the color wheel here. I will say to any gardener, you are the author and the creator of your space. So, always thinking about, in that regard, whatever color works for you is great, right? But I have this here as just some color hues to kind of think about neighboring colors on the color wheel, or even adjacent colors on the color wheel as complementary colors like red and green. Here we have wonderful greens that are growing next to red, and it gives a really dramatic pop of color. Or even our greens and our purples, you know, chives, which are amazing, right? And then we have our dianthus, our perennials mixed with our lettuce. So there's a number of ways that you can do that. I mean, here, like all of these are just inspirational notes of how or what that could even look like, you know? So there's a lot but there. And I will also know, and I looked at the hues. Deer, I just looked at the chat just really quickly. Deer do not like really strong smelling crops. So like usually if a deer is hungry enough, they're just going to go for it. I will say that. But usually I've had more success when I planted more garlicky or more things that have like a peppermint smell, really, really strong flowers or crops beside those yummy lettuces have been more helpful in that regard. So those are great questions. I have deer in my backyard that I'm still trying to think about that when planting, but appreciate the foliage. It's just great. Like appreciate basil. There's so many different types of basil rather than just our sweet basil. Basil is great. I love sweet basil. I make pesto all the time in the summer. But what about Thai basil or dark opal basil? And then how does that translate even into our landscape? You know, whether you're doing a container garden or a container assortment that can have different kind of basil colors in it, then that's amazing. Or again, lettuces, really using those purples or green hues and mixing them together strategically using the balanced notes noted earlier of color and rhythm and texture. And kale, you know, kale is wonderful to have purple and greens when we're speaking about color and foliage appreciation, or even our cabbages. You know, these are all just great color combinations that are, you know, you don't even have to try as hard because it's right there for you for our edible crops. So some color combinations that are, you know, maybe recommended or that you could try if you're just like, well, I don't know where to start. Well, here are some that I've had success in. Purple and green cabbage are great. You know, green and purple kale, you'll note that there's a trend here, purple and green, because that's a lot of whatever crops we're working with, right? Even rainbow chard, that's something that's other than purple. You know, we have our rainbow chard can have pink and orange and yellow all on the same plant.
Hey, get inside, you doofus.
Okay. And then, so even going through arrangement, you know, as we're wrapping up our design tips, arrangement, thinking about how we can establish and create visual interest. And arrangement doesn't just have to be in landscape. I, again, plant in pots, often container gardens. A lot of my students don't have a lot of access to space. So how can you create arrangements and something of interest even in a container garden? Here I have my peas that are going up a trellis, a PVC pipe. I'm all for using what you have. And then at the underlaying, I have strawberries growing. And if you look really, really closely, you see I have some netting because I live in a forested area and squirrels just love you know, it's always that blend of how do you mix ornamental function and also keep the squirrels or deers away. So for our arrangement, thinking about height, strategically looking at vertical elements, how you can use them, and I'll have images of that later. Trying to think about underplanting, thinking about your border plants, and then also creating focal points. So for example, think about when you're trying to create in a garden that is ornamental, or even in a foodscape garden, think about how you can draw the eye up and the crops that are great for that. Beans, peas, even squashes, cucumbers. These are all amazing crops that can help, you know, create a vertical element in your garden. And they're really, really wonderful to even think about. And also I will say, think about when you're trying to create your arches, and also the crops. That's very contingent upon like your arch and the size of that, and also the size of your containers contingent upon the crop that you want to grow. Usually I'm trying to grow crops that are that don't require a lot of space. Like I'll opt for pole beans, or I'll opt for cucumbers. I haven't done that as much as far as an arch, but more of a trellis to create vertical spaces as well. So moving forward, thinking about arrangement, thinking about how you can create borders, and thinking about the high and also the low. So high meaning this chart is higher than perhaps these herbs here, So thinking about how you can create scale in a garden space. And at Kilgore, which is where I frequent because I teach there all the time throughout the week, I'm exploring like how to integrate edibles and foodscaping within an ornamental landscape. And we have a wonderful ornamental landscape at Kilgore, but we're strategically integrating food within that landscape as well. So if you look really closely, I spy for those who grow strawberries. Strawberries are an amazing perennial border plant, which are just really great to have in the garden. And I will say this, and I have a little note about wildlife and growing in a landscape like this. So here are our strawberries, and here I just have like a little note of how the strawberries are, just to show you an example of what they look like. But as I'm talking through this, it was interesting that I was doing a planting with my students, and we have squirrels and also rabbits on campus. So here it's just an example of here's the strawberries, and just showing you what they can look like in that regard. And before I show you the example, which is on the next slide of lessons learned, even when our edible crops go to flower, they can add some really nice interest. So here we have collards that have gone to flower, and while they might not taste as yummy, they are really pretty and still add some nice textural quality within the garden as well. A couple of lessons learned as I'm going to go to annuals and perennials that are my favorite, and that's more so of a list. Lessons learned that I've had so far, and I'm sure there's many lessons that I'll learn along the way. And you'll probably wonder, like, okay, I only see 2 cabbage plants here. There are more cabbage plants that were planted here. And it was really sobering for students to be like, we planted so much. What happened, Remi? I'm really sad that just didn't work out. I've noted that I've had more success in planting my foodscapes when I create a more diverse planting environment. And when I say more diverse planting environment, and let me see if I can toggle not awkwardly between my slides, but what I'll say is what in this example here that I'm showing you before I go to another slide to show you is that our rabbits and our squirrels had easy access to these plants because it was in a field of nothing. And there weren't a lot of flowers to prohibit it from our squirrels and our rabbits to get to these crops. And in an ornamental landscape, oftentimes we may not have a lot of fencing. And those are things that I'm still toggling back and forth. So I wanted just to be upfront that, we're still learning some things along the way. But what I have learned for the crops that actually did survive and were more robust, and this is just an example, say not my image by any means, but this is just to note that for the crops that had more plants, more flowers, even more texture, and being very strategic about what types of plants you put in your garden, in your foodscape, there was less of a squirrel invasion, I'll say, or less of rabbits really taking over and trying to nibble those crops. So I would say plant diversity is really, really important in your foodscape, not only to add visual interest, but just the practicality of, you all are probably very frequent with squirrels or also rabbits. So just keeping that in mind, that you want to make sure that you have a diverse planting rather than just a silo planting, because when you just have a couple of, random or sparsely placed plants and food in a foodscape, then they're more prone to predators, or not predators, but, wildlife, I'll say that. All right, so just even going into just a little bit more of our design tips are things to think about, as noted, and summarizing more so. Arrange permanent elements. Think about your planters, if you're using raised planters, and where you're going to place them. So think about if you're going to have an arch, pathways, seating, and kind of create your landscape around these permanent elements. Establish focal points, which are always great. Using plants for infrastructural qualities, like focal points can be, again, this arch that's in this image here, really strategically using raised beds and also pathways. Consider also adding ornamental and productive plants, as noted. How do you strategically do that? We have our dahlias here that are integrated beautifully with these food producing crops. And there's great space for both to really exist very well. Even here, it's as an example of how you can have a more open space, a space that's more public, integrating even kale, or having an assortment of perhaps these could even be carrots within these, because carrots have wonderful, great textural tops. So just really trying to create some nice spatial elements, really thinking about your arrangement and trying to create focal points with your design. Now, I wanted to land on like the how, but then also a little bit more of the what, annuals and perennials, and what kind of plants I've had really great success using in a foodscape garden. For annuals, understanding that here's some things to think about. For annuals, usually they have a shorter season, and they may not look good all year round. So for our tomatoes, if you want to incorporate tomatoes in a foodscape garden, first, going back to our original questions, they may take more care. They may not look as amazing in the ending season, the senescent season, and may require more maintenance. So those are kind of things to think about. A lot of, even thinking about our peppers, they might require a little bit more maintenance, or even our cucumbers more specifically, because you need a lot of great irrigation for our cucumbers to thrive well. So just really thinking about those things. More harvesting may be required for that. And even for our perennials, which again, advocate for perennials if you can in a garden. Here you even see in this image strawberries and also rosemary mixed with echinacea or coneflowers. How to maintain a year-round aesthetic. Perennials really do that well, and they reemerge year after year, which is really great. And they're generally lower maintenance. And here are some crops that I really love. A assortment of berries. So whether it's elderberries, blackberries, raspberries, mulberries, even fig trees, which I don't think get enough love maybe. And foodscapes, fig trees are wonderful because they have a large presence, but then also you can harvest from them. So these are just a snapshot of perennials that I've had great success with. And if any of you have grown blueberries, not only are they wonderful to harvest from, but they provide an amazing fall color. And having this red as an extra pop in the garden is just a great addition to any kind of foodscape. And herbs are wonderful as well. There's a lot of perennial herbs that are great, like oregano, lavender, lemon balm, mint. Of course, being very strategic, because mint and lemon balm can kind of spread out and can be a little invasive, of being very strategic. But there are a lot of our herbs that are great for that have a perennial presence. And this is just an example of how you can have a wonderful perennial foodscape as well. And here are just some images for highlights in that regard, of just what it could kind of look like. And here's some just container examples. So even with our edible gardens, or thinking about foodscaping, going beyond just a traditional landscape, I wanted to land on this. Even I would encourage all to start small. If you have clients or people that you're working with or advising, starting small is a great place to start, just so you can see how those plants work seasonally. So here's some edible containers, just to show you some examples of edible containers that I have, ranging from lemon balm or sages, and how I mix even thyme or oregano in a unique way, or as showing you pictures from, earlier strawberries, thinking of vertical and also lower crops, and additionally how you can integrate chard and, dianthus or different kind of flowering blooms as well. So in the closing notes, and I just wanted to be mindful of time, and this is probably the fastest that I've done this presentation, but just being very mindful of time, but really wanted to leave with the closing notes. And our foodscapes can look many ways, and our foodscapes can be large, like this image right here, and more robust, or even smaller in containers. I think the bigger thing to note, and I want to leave you with, is like really rethinking why and how we use our landscapes. Ornamental flowers are amazing, but what if we really use our landscapes beyond just the ornamental, beyond just the beauty, but also matching that function? And foodscaping is a great way to do just that, being able to harvest from the land that you grow on. And here's some, I know that extension resources were shared, but also I just wanted to highlight some different books. I wanted to note that I am not a North Carolina resident, or not from North Carolina, so I was from Boston beforehand. So a lot of these books it has seasonality recommendations from all the way to New England, all the way to North Carolina. Even in some of my recommendations, I even highlighted some of those cues as well. But these are great resources: Foodscaping and Beautiful Edible Garden. And then there's some extension resources that are great. And I want to say thank you for having me here. Here's my contact information. If you're interested or you have any questions about any of the things that I talked about, you can feel free to reach me at my email here. So with that, I'll close.
Oh, thank you so much, Remi. That was wonderful. I know your presentation was just refreshing and inspiring. Such gorgeous photos. I think we're all ready to get out there and make some color combinations happen. So as everyone knows, that these Plants, Pests, and Pathogens presentations are recorded. So you all will get the recording of this later on, and you can reference some of Remi's color combinations, plant suggestions, and her contact information. All that will be coming on the recording. I'm scanning through the chat for looking for some questions, but I also had one that I thought we could talk about, and it might be a way to share another extension resource. I think about, for instance, the question master gardeners might encounter about, hey, can I plant edible crops in this part of my garden? Should I be concerned about the soil that's there? And that makes me think about, Lucy's resources about learning about chemical contaminants in the soil. And I will put that link in the chat. I just wanted to ask you, when you're working with people and thinking about design, and do you kind of advise the play it safe and put it in pots, or know more about your own garden? What do you do with that question, Remi?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's why I always kind of start there. I'm like, with any food that you're growing, food production course, I'm like, all right, start with the soil. Foundation is key. So foundation is key for, your foodscape, as well as, your traditional home garden. So I would say first, always get it tested out if you wanted to, grow in that regard. But containers are amazing, and I think sometimes they're not sold up enough. So you can have some large containers, small containers, an assortment of containers and colors. So yeah, soil and understanding the soil and what conditions you're working with is very important part of that process. And if you would like to get started beforehand, I'd certainly recommend, raised beds or container gardening rather. I have an edible foodscape. I incorporate ornamental flowers even in my raised bed garden. So it doesn't have to just be vegetable crops in your raised bed gardens. I have an assortment of flowers in there as well. So those are great things.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of great compliments coming in. And as you know, later today in this presentation, I'm going to share a resource that relates to designing edible gardens that colleagues of yours have written. So we'll learn a little bit more later in the presentation about another resource people can use to think about the space and what to choose and that sort of thing.
Awesome.
Excellent. So there is one question that came in. Jean's asking a little bit about planting over a septic field. Have you ever encountered that question, Remi? To me, that brings up more about the concerns about the roots of the plants that you're putting in that spot rather than what you're planting. But we may not be the right people to answer that question.
Yeah, I have not encountered something as that, again, always thinking about making sure that you're have an understanding of what foundation you're planting in, especially if you're planning to eat from it.
Right.
So, I think that's always one to work with Extension for testing, and even working with your local town or municipality to see what kind of soil condition as it relates to septic. I was even going to, I think Shirley, I was going off of one of the questions from the chat. I was just looking through really quickly, as far as, I think the question says, what do you do with empty spaces after a crop is harvested, such as kale? Right. That's a great question. That's why I love succession planting. I'm just like, all right, well, great thing about kale is you harvest them from the bottom up. So the kale doesn't necessarily go away. You just have a little bit of a skinnier kale at the bottom and then have more of a party at the top kind of thing. So kale is great for that. But there is, planting that, just like you would with any kind of food garden, whether you're just doing just fully crop production, you're really thinking about, okay, if I am going to harvest this kale, or let me think about, even if I mentioned carrots or root crops, which have wonderful tops, thinking about how you can plant in sequence. Tomatoes, I started to try tomatoes in a foodscape when I have more time. And those are crops that you do have to really think about when it comes to August. What does it kind of look like? And I would say my suggestion would be to be really mindful of, if I'm going to grow tomatoes, for example, be mindful of maybe integrating that beautiful flowering ornamental plant beside it. So that way, when it's maybe not looking as sightly, you can have your coneflowers or echinacea kind of saying, okay, and
very smart. Yeah.
There. So that's
taking the eye away from that spot.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
I wanted to add one thing with the septic field question, that there's two issues with gardening over septic fields. One is contamination. If your septic field was to fail and you were to actually get effluent coming to the surface, so that's a concern. But the other thing is, if you're gardening on top of a septic field, you'll be watering those plants, and you don't want to add extra water to your drain field. So that's actually a bigger concern for a functioning septic field, is that you are going to be adding more water onto it, which can contribute to the septic field failing sooner than it would have. So in general, it's not recommended to garden on a septic field.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, and I see you put a good resource in the chat about that too. All right, with that, Remi, will say thank you so much for being here today and sharing your expertise with us and inspiring us to get out there and integrate and help others integrate edible crops with what they're doing in their landscapes.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Happy gardening, everyone. Wishing you the best this growing season. So take care.
Thanks, Remi. All right, and so with that, I will ask Matt to get ready to share his Be on the Lookouts for the season ahead, the month ahead. And after that, Mike to share his. So good morning, Matt and Mike.
Good morning. Thanks, Caroline, for introducing us, and thank you very much, Remi. If I don't know if you're still on, but that was really great, and very nice to meet you virtually. Hopefully, we'll see you around. Maybe see you around Kilgore Hall too, walking around. So let me share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see this and hear me. So yeah, today I'm going to tell you about some be on the lookouts for late March to late April, kind of until our next webinar. These are arthropods, insects and relatives that you might be on the lookout for. So it is, we're kind of in a transition. It's gotten warm out. So some of these things are already out in certain parts of the states. Others are going to just be emerging. But things to be on the lookout for are boxwood leaf miners. So if your boxwoods are sprouting well, or are growing new growth, and you see a lot of these little tiny orange gnats flying around them, that means you've got boxwood leaf miners interested in it. And they will lay their eggs in those leaves where the maggots will develop. You're going to see a lot of bees and wasps being active right now. This is the time of year when they wake up and they come out of hibernation in order to make new nests. So you're gonna be seeing a lot of male carpenter bees flying around. They have the yellow face, fighting for territories to make the nests in the wood. And later on, you're gonna start to see the females, which have much rounder black faces. And I've seen, we've actually had some samples come in of issues with paper wasps. I've seen a lot of them flying around. They're looking for nectar sources for energy, and they're going to start building these little paper nests on the eaves of houses and places like that. So the queens are waking up and are able to start making these nests. You may be seeing some other critters out there. These dark Hoplia beetles. I posted on both these recently a news item. In fact, I got a video of a house where there's a chimney that keeps getting swarmed every year from them. These little beetles only emerge in the spring. They may feed on flowers, but they're really not a pest except for being a nuisance when they sometimes enter homes. This person's chimney is being swarmed by them. Apparently they find visual kind of these landmarks to fly around to mate. So if you have a landmark that they like, then they may be coming in your home. We also got a sample yesterday, photos of clover mites. So clover mites are plant feeding mites. They are not parasites. But when they feed on the new growth in the spring, they like this cooler season before it gets too warm. They will maybe sometimes be in huge numbers and crawl into homes. So be on the lookout for those as well. Other things, emerging and hatching and becoming active are going to be mantids. You're going to start seeing the little baby ones soon. As well as many of the bugs out there, like leaf-footed bugs and wheel bug nymphs. These are, of course, hatching. Some of the adults of some of these bugs are already out, and they're laying eggs that will hatch as well. Okay. You may also be seeing some caterpillars. So this is the time of year when the inchworms, the fall cankerworms, will hatch. They'll start feeding on the new growth on these plants. Especially trees. They'll feed on all different types of trees, and they'll come kind of hanging down on silken threads sometimes. I don't know if we'll have big outbreaks this year or not, but it does happen every once in a while. You may also start seeing eastern tent caterpillars. These typically feed on rosaceous hosts like black cherry, apples, things like that. They have they're fuzzy caterpillars with this white line down the back. They're fairly large, and they create those large masses in the crotches of trees, and they are spring active species. The scales will be mating. Scale insects may be mating, especially soft scales. Here's a male on a female, which will then lead to eggs, which will then lead to crawlers, which will begin infesting more parts of the plants. So be on the lookout for them. If you have a plant that's particularly infested. And white grubs. If you're digging around in your soil, you're preparing your gardens, maybe you're preparing edible gardens, as we just heard about, you may be digging up some of these white grubs. I wouldn't worry too much about them being in an area unless you find a lot of them and you see a lot of activity from birds or the grass or things like that seem to be dying. Many of these white grubs are just kind of incidental, feeding on rotting material, rotting wood material, especially if you're digging around stumps, feeding on bits of soil and bits of roots, grass roots, and other plant roots, but not usually a major damaging problem. So just be aware, if you find one or two here or there, it's not going to be a huge deal. If you find a lot, that might be something to consider using some kind of control. And then again, more things emerging. Termite swarmers may be coming out. So these are the winged members of the colony that are going out to the kings and queens. The new kings and queens are going out to mate and create new colonies out there. Keep in mind that if they are emerging from kind of mulch or beds or out in the woods or things like that, they're probably feeding on something in the soil, not on your home. But as they get closer to your home, or if you find them emerging inside the home, that's definitely a time to call a pest control specialist to come out and look at the house and inspect for termites or damage. And the close relatives of termites, cockroaches, you can see a lot of activity of cockroaches, slugs, spiders, all these different things kind of waking up and crawling around, being a lot more active since it's warmer. And I will now look in the chat to see if there are some questions for me. And let's see. So how much damage do carpenter bees do to homes and structures? They can, in certain situations, do some damage, but I will tell you that they are nearly impossible to control. And if you plug up holes and things like that, that's really just going to make them create more holes and more damage. They will reuse nests each year, so oftentimes they don't extend the holes as much if they're not plugged or year after year. But really, there's not a lot you can do to keep them from boring into the wood. It's just an unfortunate thing. We are doing, there is a researcher doing work here at NC State on carpenter bees and looking at materials that might help or ways that might help. But really, there's not a lot that can be done to control carpenter bees or keep them from being attracted to those areas of wood where they would like to make their nests. Unfortunately, we've taken down all the trees that they like to nest in, typically in nature. Let's see, last year, many of us in Salem had swarms of aphids all over the hellebores. I've been growing them for at least 15 years and never saw this before. Is this odd or something up? I really have no idea. I'd have to see what types of aphids they were. So that's really the short answer, unfortunately, to the question. Boxwood mites have a very special old box that I'd like to protect. It would be worth to use a row cover to protect it. The adults active for a long time. Boxwood mites are cool active. They're actually just about done their activity for right now. They may come back and start feeding again when it gets cool again in the fall, but once it starts to get really warm, they're not going to be as active and you rarely find them. I would just search, we have a fact sheet on boxwood spider mites, and that can tell you some things to do, but I'm not sure row cover, I'm not sure what that means. So I'm not sure, but there are tips on controlling boxwood spider mites online. Any control for box elder bugs? So box elder bugs right now are kind of probably leaving their hibernation. They're one of the bugs that hibernates as adults. They do prefer maple seeds, so the samaras, to feed on, but really they're just a nuisance. So I wouldn't worry about them harming plants. First of all, they're not going to harm the actual plants. And really, if you're worried about control for their nuisance, being a nuisance somewhere, I would say if you can stand them outside, that's fine. If they're coming indoors, really what you have to do is to make sure you seal all the gaps and little crevices and places that they can get in, especially if you are nearby a lot of maples that produce a lot of these bugs. We don't see them a ton here in the central and eastern parts of the state, but they're probably much more common up in the western part of the state. Okay, my husband is already collecting ticks on his body. Yes, ticks are active all year round, so be careful. Use permethrin on clothing and on your pants and on boots and shoes. But yes, they are active all year round, basically. Mason bees are wrapping up. Yep, so some of the solitary bees are already out and about and are just about wrapping up their season. Others are just getting started. It's really species specific. I have a Muhlenbergia mealbugs last year. Does cutting back the grass help trap plants nearby? So the muhly grass mealybugs, these are common in the eastern part of the state. Actually, let's see how many. Okay, so this is the last one. Okay, I don't want to cut into Mike's time, but these mealybugs are becoming more common on this grass. They are native to the southeast, but there are probably some fact sheets online. Cutting back can't hurt. It'll get rid of some of the population, but you'd probably have to treat because they're going to be little crawlers and things like that all over, and they're going to reestablish again. So if you cut them back, I would say you're going to want to do some other control while it's growing to keep them from establishing again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and if there are any more questions, I'll just type them in the chat.
Thank you, Matt. Sounds good. Good morning, Mike. And just as a reminder that I capture these resources and these go out in the follow-up email that I'll send after Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. So you'll have resources that you've seen coming up in the chat all collected there for you. And they will also be on the NCEMG intranet under Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, which we talked about last week. And Mike, how are you doing?
Good. How is everybody this morning?
Good. All right. Nice to see you.
Likewise. So I'm going to start out my bolos with a couple of quiz questions. Call them polls here. So let me launch that. And everyone can think about this question. If you see this mass of orange teleal horns, they're called, growing from a gall on a juniper, they will produce spores. But the question for you is, are these spores going to be capable of infecting apples, junipers, oaks, or pines? Which one of those would they go to? So give folks a minute to think about that. And to answer, I know you can't see the answers coming in, but we've got them fast and furious here. We're already up to 70 folks who have answered. And we'll just let it go for a few more seconds here while we talk about this. All right, let's go ahead and show those results. Are those showing up in your screens?
Yes, they are.
So we have the plurality who have said apples. Some said junipers, which would be a reinfection of the same host. Very few oaks and a few pines in here. Well, in fact, in this particular case, the answer is, well, why don't we wait a minute and talk about that after we see our next question. The next question actually has the same set of answers. So here is a large canker, or excuse me, large gall on a pine tree, a photo taken a couple of weeks ago, producing these dry, pale orange spores, and they're going to blow off in the wind, and the lucky ones are going to be able to infect. Which will we have? So let me just relaunch that poll. Let's see. So different circumstance. Now, which one do you think is going to be the host for the spores that are produced here on these galls on the pine? Wow, and people really even jumped on this one faster than the first one. All right, let's see how the results look so far. We see fairly low numbers for apples and junipers, really no lumbers. No lumbers? Well, it's no lumber out of this tree. Low numbers for oak and a plurality for pine. Actually, that's a majority in this case for pines. So, well, let's just see. We'll talk about these in turn. The first one, and I think everyone recognized it based on your answers, is the cedar apple rust. And this is the time of year now, those first warm spring rains, depending on where you are in the state, where the gelatinous teleal horns will emerge from the galls that developed during the course of last year, and will produce basidiospores that will be windblown, and those that are fortunate enough will land on either an apple or a crab apple and cause the bright yellow orange spots that we'll see early in the summer on the leaves of those hosts. So this is what we call a heteroecious rust, meaning it has two houses, and it has to, in order to complete its life cycle, it has to alternate between these two unrelated hosts from juniper to apple, and then in the summertime, the spores produced on apple will blow over and hopefully for them land on a juniper where they can cause the infection that then develops into the gall. So the plurality was correct in this particular case. This particular disease is fusiform rust. And you can kind of tell that by the spindle-shaped form of the large gall here. The spores produced here, though. Now, does anyone want to revise their vote based on the scientific name? So it's Crenartium quercum Forma specialis fusiforme. So you can probably figure it out from the quercum that the alternate host here is actually oak. So the same time that the little oak leaves are emerging, developing, expanding, we have the spores from this particular rust fungus that will, if they find them, develop into pretty inconspicuous lesions on the oak leaves and tiny, almost hair-like short telea that will produce the spores that go back to pine. This particular infection would have occurred years ago. It typically takes 2 years even to get the first production of spores, but then this clearly has been developing for some time. It's the needles and the succulent shoots that are susceptible to infection, but then it can move down into a main branch like this. It will actually kill small trees of the pines, and of course it disfigures them on the larger ones. All right. We have seen a lot of boxwoods in the clinic this year. I didn't run the numbers recently, but we're ahead of last year, last time I checked, and it just seemed to be quite a few coming out of both. Well, we got quite a few from home landscapes and also a few from commercial landscapes. And one of the problems that we're seeing a lot is boxwood dieback. This would be, I would say at this point, should be your first suspicion when you see a boxwood that otherwise looks healthy, but has individual stems that are where the leaves are yellowing, but hanging on. So the leaves don't drop off here. They fade, they turn this very pale color and on individual branches. And I didn't show a picture here, but if you were to cut under the bark there or into the wood as you move down on these, you would see that there's darkening under the surface there and sometimes quite well into the wood. So that's another symptom that you would use when diagnosing this. So boxwood dieback, also called boxwood stem canker, caused by the fungus Calototricum theobromicola. So that's going to be a prime suspect when you see this particular set of symptoms. However, if you are in the eastern part of the state, Matt can correct me if I'm wrong on this, so hint, this is not going to be a disease. You also want to look in these cases to see if there aren't boreholes. This picture here was a sample that just came in last week and hasn't been officially identified yet, but I would bet Matt lunch that's going to turn out to be the black twig borer. Matt, would you say it's fair to say that that's something eastern half of North Carolina?
I would not doubt it being all over North Carolina. This is not, the black twig borer is all over the place, basically, but it may be more common there now.
And it does not just get on boxwood. So probably the most common thing that I would think you would find it on would be causing the death of the tips of branches of southern magnolia. So always look for those little boreholes as well. A third possibility when you're seeing individual branches of boxwood dying, and I don't have I didn't grab a picture from a landscape plant, but these are from the nursery. This is actually Volutella blight or Volutella canker, where you can get death of portion of the branch that then causes the rest of the branch to flag from there out. This is, though, a weak pathogen or an opportunistic pathogen when the box was under stress. So oftentimes from drought stress. So I would still, I would keep this in mind as a possibility, but the boxwood stem canker would be the more aggressive pathogen of the two. In both cases, your control measure is going to be to prune them out and going several inches into clean wood. Now, that may not be possible if the infection has already reached the very base, the kind of crown of the plant there. So then it may be game over, but that would be the strategy to take. I also mentioned here, it's something to definitely be on the lookout for because we're not out of the woods yet. And at least in all of the state, we're not out of the woods yet. Not in all the states are. No, not in all of North Carolina are we out of the woods yet in terms of possible freezes. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. I suspect that's what happened to the tips here. And just to wrap up the boxwood woes here, you can have more than one problem at a time. So this particular one classic symptoms of boxwood dieback there with the one branch that turned completely yellow, but you also see some bronzing there. So maybe there's some other, maybe that's the beginning of more boxwood dieback, but this plant had to be under a tremendous amount of stress. You can see from the way that the roots were really galled by root knot nematodes. Just a quick run through of some of the bolos, things to be on the lookout for late March into late April. Spot anthracnose of dogwood. In our area, the dogwoods are coming into bloom. Depending on our weather conditions, we may see more or less of this particular fungal pathogen, causes spotting on the bracts there, can also cause spotting on the leaves, but it's a cosmetic problem. It's not going to cause the health of the tree to decline. And this again is not to be confused with dogwood anthracnose, only really concerned for folks in the mountains, but it is a different disease with a similar name and different symptoms. You may have been noticing it all winter, but you'll still be noticing it now, our ever-present Entomosporium leaf spot. Now the fungus is called Diplocarpon mespili, and Indian hawthorns also on red tip photinia. So you'll see these bright red spots with the gray centers and the blister-like fungal fruiting bodies in them. Another thing that you want to be on the lookout for on your camellias will be the Exobasidium leaf gall. So kind of a waxy thickening of the leaves. This overwintered in the buds and is now going to be becoming active as those buds develop. You want to catch it early because the thing to do here is to prune those out before the spores are released. That's the kind of white fuzziness on the underside. Once those spores are released, they'll find a place to then spend in a bud somewhere and then do this again next year. So again, pruning, vigilance, that's what you want on this disease. Moving to a couple of the more herbaceous type plants. Volutella leaf and stem blight of Pachysandra. We don't see it that often, but it's pretty dramatic, or it can be when it occurs. You notice that both the leaves and the stems showing symptoms here, with the fungus now known as Coccinonectria pachysandricola. This is most problematic where the plants are getting too much sun because they do like their shade. And another one, we don't see it that often, but it is very dramatic and you could be able to diagnose yourself, is the iris leaf spot, also called Heterosporium leaf spot because of the name that the fungus used to have. The name that the fungus used to go by, now it is classified as Cladosporium iridis that would affect irises. And I can just let's see if I can go to the chat here real quickly and drop in the link to a Virginia Tech publication about this particular disease. All right. Finally, and you notice that I've scratched out disease here, but another bolo, or just about any plant in the landscape as people get active in their gardens again. Anybody know what this is? On blueberry. No takers? All right, this is suspected glyphosate injury. The odd thing here is that that would have occurred, the exposure would have occurred the previous year, and the herbicide is actually stored in plant tissues, depending on the timing and of the application. It can be stored in the plant tissues over the winter and then cause deformation of the new growth emerging in the spring. So that particular pattern, as well as new damage from glyphosate drift to on non-target areas, is something that we will see in the spring as, again, people start getting out their sprayers. Well, I did say finally before, but just another reminder to keep in mind what's going on below ground as well as above ground. So Phytophthora and armillaria root rots, root knot nematode, we saw an example of earlier on boxwood. Also think of it on gardenia and other nematodes as well, especially on boxwoods and on azaleas. And I think that that'll wrap it up for the disease bolos for the next month. If you are a glutton for punishment and want more, just go to our website, look on the red menu banner on the left and click on bolos.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
So yes, I see we have some chat questions here. Let me go back. All right, looks like Matt has already replied to a couple of them here about the black twig borers. Did you say it's okay to cut back freeze injury on plants or wait? Well, at this point, things are going to be emerging. Yes, you can go ahead and prune that out. You want to avoid heavy pruning late in these seasons, so in the fall, because that may stimulate succulent growth that would then be susceptible to the freeze injury. I'm not sure if that maybe is where the question was coming from, but at this point, yeah, spring is coming. It's almost inevitable. So the growth is going to be coming on. Black twig borer fact sheet.
Yeah, Matt has been doing a great job catching us up there.
Yep.
And I will collect those fact sheets for us.
The only other question I see is from Pat Willinger. Would this injury grow itself out? On the blueberry. All that depends on how much the exposure was. So some plants will recover. It may take years, but will recover from herbicide injury. In other cases, it's too much and it's not going to make it. So that's one of those it depends situations.
All right, thank you. So I will now take my turn and share my screen, because what I want to do today is walk you through a publication that I referred to earlier when Remi was presenting. But first, to give you a reminder of how to find these publications. This is the NC State Extension publication homepage. And what's wonderful is you can just put a term in the search bar here. I put edible, thinking about Remi's presentation today, and I came up with these two publications. And the second one is the one I'm going to talk to you more about. But keep this in mind. This is an easy and fast way to find those NC State publications, extension publications. In addition to using Google, it'll often come up. But here is the hub of the wheel, so to speak. You can also browse if you're interested in browsing by category or a collection. So the document I wanted to tell you about is called Growing Edibles in the Landscape. And it was written by 4 members of the Horticultural Science Department a couple of years ago. And it targets much of what we talked about today. So I want to walk you through that. What is really neat about it is it gives you a couple of different things. It gives you some example designs to think through in terms of the landscape that you might be considering, or that someone who's asking you a question about would be considering. It gives you great lists of suggested plants, and all those plants link to the plant toolbox. So I just want to take you there and show you a little more. So for instance, the document will actually has 3 different scenarios. And here's the actual fact sheet. It's got 3 different scenarios. If you wanted to make your landscape, for instance, say you wanted to have 15% of your landscape be made up of edible plants, you could envision that with using these diagrams and the plant lists. If you wanted to go bigger and have 50% of your landscape be edible plants, or even if you wanted to have it be as much as 90%. So it's just an interesting way that they thought through integrating edible plants into a landscape. And it gives you those diagrams to reference. The other thing that's neat, like I said, is it's organized for you plant lists by size and function in the landscape, as well as seasonality. So as you're planning your landscape, you can see these tables that are prepared for you. For instance, if you're going to look at flowering and fruiting color during the different seasons of the year, they've got that across the top of this table. And what are the features that might be appealing about that plant? everything from trees, shrubs, perennials, vegetables, annuals. And all of these link right out to the plant toolbox. So that's wonderful because right there and handy are the rest of the details about those plants. So take advantage of that document, share it with the public, and hopefully it will help kind of take what Remi discussed with us and apply it for you. And with that, I will move on to the month's Master Gardener announcements. This is an announcement I mentioned last month, but I'm going to repeat it today. The second edition of the Extension Gardener Handbook has come out, and what we're asking is for some help from you providing a review of the book on Amazon. This is a new edition, and so it's a new listing on Amazon. And so by providing reviews, we basically help increase the opportunity for the book to come up when folks search on that on the browsers or on Amazon. So if you have a minute to please write a quick review, that's the link there to help us promote the Extension Gardener Handbook in the second edition. Also, Extension Gardener is starting to plan their travel study adventures for the remainder of this year and also next year. And we would love a little bit of help from you in terms of just gauging interest. These are the trips and the destinations that they're thinking about. They're thinking about a trip this fall, late August, early September, to the Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia area. So that would be the only other trip planned for this year. And then looking ahead, they're considering an April trip to the Netherlands for tulip time, and a May trip, which would actually be a domestic trip to see some of the horticultural gems that are just within a bus ride from here. So it would be a road trip, and it would feature some gardens in the Philadelphia area, in the Wilmington, Delaware area, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia. So it would help us if you have any interest in these trips, that you would just please fill out this quick survey. Just gives us an idea if these are trips that are worth pursuing for this year and next year. And Extension Gardener is, of course, offering their plant ID classes, their garden and landscape series, and their therapeutic horticulture series. And those are all in full swing. So the next couple of slides remind you about those. The plant ID classes, some of them have just begun, some of them are coming up. So now's a good time to look at your calendar and consider if you wanted to get in on one of these classes. It's nice to be able to announce a new class. There is a new class in plant propagation that Laura Barth is teaching in collaboration with Longwood Gardens. So this is a class that just began, but she's also running it again in October. So think about that one. The Garden and Landscape course series is a 5-class series being taught by Dr. George Place. And all of that actually is asynchronous, and you can do it at your own pace. And at the end of completing those 5 classes, earn a Garden and Landscape Certificate of Mastery. So the link is there to look into that. And therapeutic horticulture starts beginning of next month. So this is also an opportunity for you to think about. The International Master Gardener Conference is coming up in June 18th through 22nd in Kansas. And it's really neat to see that they already have over 1,000 Master Gardeners registered to come to the conference. Registration is still open if you would like to consider that, but that should be a really amazing gathering. That is held every other year in the odd years. And that brings us to the end of our March edition. And we look forward to seeing you next month on April 25th. Matt and Mike will give us some detail on pest and plant disease issues of cucurbits. So those are all of our squashes and cucumbers and zucchinis and pumpkins, that family of plants. So we look forward to seeing you then. And thanks, everyone. We hope you get outside and get inspired to integrate some edibles.